I'm a bit uncomfortable with sharing my voice, so for this tutorial, I will be using this text-to-speech program. Quick disclaimer, I'm using an editing software called Davinci Resolve. It might be a bit difficult to follow this tutorial if you're not using Davinci Resolve. That said, it should work with any 3D supportive program. But if not, if the tools are called different or if it's just not making any sense, there are loads of other tutorials out there, covering how to make this effect in Blender, for example. But if you're still here, I hope you'll find this tutorial helpful. And since this is an in-depth tutorial, I will not only cover each step in detail, but also explain why we are doing it. That way, every step should be easy to follow, even if you're new to DaVinci or have never used Fusion before. And so, without any further ado, let's drag out a Fusion composition to our timeline. The length of this will determine how long the vortex will be on screen, like a video clip. By the way, I'm using 24 frames per second. You don't have to, but we'll get into that later. Anyways, let's jump into Fusion by pressing this wand icon, and here you'll see this sort of grid. This is where we'll create the Time Vortex Effect using different tools. And so let's bring out an image plane and drag this to the first viewer. You can either drag it like this or select it and press 1 on your keyboard, or 2 to bring it to the second viewer. And with these viewers, we are able to see our image plane in 3D space. Now let's quickly add a background and mask it with an ellipse. Inside the background node, under the Image tab, we are going to be checking off the auto resolution and setting the width to 1080. And under the Color tab, we are going to make it a bit brighter for it to be easier to see against this dark background. Then, inside the Ellipse node, we are going to check off Solid and set the width to about 0.08, like that. And by dragging on this edge, here, you can extend the circle, like so. Then, if we drag this small square, like this, it becomes an arrow that we can plug into the Image node, like this, to make a ring. Now, we're going to hit Shift and Space to bring up this window, where you can find a lot of tools. But we are going to use this search bar to search for Duplicate 3D, and add that. Then if we select this and bring it to the first viewer, you will see that absolutely nothing has changed. That is because 1. We only have 2 copies, and 2. There's 0 distance between them. So let's set the last copy to 10 and expand the distance to get this sort of tunnel. If you were to move these towards the camera, it kinda already looks like a really dull version of Capaldi's intro. And it is really boring, right? So let's fix that. Inside the Duplicate tool under Rotation, if we play around with the X rotation, we get curvature. Here you can see how the different X, Y, and Z rotations bend the tunnel along their respective axes. The plural of axis is axes, not axises. But now if we move these towards the camera, they end up all over the place. We are going to fix this by placing the camera here, and making the rings follow the shape of a circle that will then rotate through the camera, like this. So it looks like we are moving through the vortex. So let's make a circle. First, we go into the Duplicate node and reset all these values. Instead of manually typing 0 here, you can actually just press this small circle to reset the value to what it was. Let's set the last copy to 50 and the Z offset to 4. But in the X rotation, we are going to write an equals sign which will link it to an expression. Here we will type 360, divided by, in this case, 50. But if we were to change the amount of copies from 50 to, say, 30, the circle would become incomplete because we're still dividing by 50. So instead of 50, we are actually going to write last copy, which is referring to the last copy of the Duplicate node. And so, now if we change this to 30, we'll still have a perfect circle. Now, before we start rotating this, let's address an issue. If we create a transform node, which we will later use to rotate the circle, we will see that the pivot is not in the center of the circle. If we try to rotate it now, it will look like this. Horrendous. So if we look at the pivot, we will see that here, it's offset by what seems to be half of a side length. We chose the side length to be 4, so half of that would be 2. But again, if we were to change the side length, this offset would change too. Therefore, we are going to create another expression, and this time right, duplicate 3D1 dot, translate, dot Z, divided by 2. This is referring to the duplicate 3D1 node, that's this one, its translate section, this one, and its Z offset here. Now let's fix the Y offset to get the pivot to the center of the circle. Let's connect the Y offset to an expression. And in order for us to do this, we're unfortunately going to have to use some heavy-duty maths. Don't worry, I won't explain it here, since it would take too much time and be really boring for some. But if you want a separate video, where I explain the maths behind all this, please leave a comment saying so. But anyways, pay close attention to what we're writing in this expression. Parenthesis. Duplicate 3D1 dot. Translate. Dot Z divided by -2, end parenthesis. All of this divided by sine, parenthesis, pi, divided by, duplicate 3D1 dot, last copy, end parenthesis. And now the pivot is right in the center of the circle. But the circle isn't actually positioned directly beneath this plane, where the camera will be. But that's an easy fix. Inside the transform node, under the translation section, we'll set the Z to equal this expression. Except we change this to a -2. So let's set the X rotation to equal the time. And let's hit play. Do you see that? Our circle is kind of bobbing up and down. So here's the thing. Sine is a mathematical function used in trigonometry. And if you were to grab a calculator and type in sine of almost anything, you would get a number with an infinite amount of decimals. And so, in this expression, we also get an infinite amount of decimals. Except Davinci Resolve can't handle an infinite amount of decimals, so it rounds it off to just 5 decimals. This results in our circle being offset by a minuscule amount. You barely notice it, but depending on the width or scale of your circles, they might clip into the camera. There are numerous ways of fixing this. 1. Expand the circles in the ellipse mask. 2. Make them thinner. 3. Inside the image node, scale up the image planes. This will make them seem closer together. But you could fix this by increasing their distance to one another, or just decreasing the amount of rings you have. You could also use larger numbers, so that it becomes less noticeable. So you see, it's not that big of a deal, and it shouldn't affect your projects too much. But it really bothers me, because I can't unsee it. Now, let's bring out a Merge 3D node and a Camera 3D node. Connect the Camera 3D node to the Merge 3D node. Then select the Merge 3D node and add a Renderer 3D node. Then connect the Renderer 3D node to the node labeled Media Out. Now, if we bring the Media Out to one of our viewers, I prefer having it on the second one, we can see our vortex. But it's really boring, right? So let's move all of this over here and add another Merge 3D node. And under the rotation section of this merge node, we will be changing the Z rotation to really sell the effect that we're moving through a warped and curved vortex. You can animate this by hand, but I am going to right-click on this Z here, which will bring up this window, and under Modify With, I will select Perturb, since I find it gives the best result. Now, under the Modifiers tab, we will set the strength to be 720. That's 360 times 2. And the speed will be around 0.16. Now, this looks better, doesn't it? And if you're not happy with the movement, you can go into the Modifiers tab again and play around with the seed, or press Reseed to get different movements. Or again, you could animate it by hand. This is totally up to you and how you want your vortex to move. Now let's change the fact that our vortex is just made up of blank circles. Let's go over here and delete these two. They were really just placeholders. Let's, instead, bring out a fast noise effect and mask it with an ellipse. In the ellipse node, we will be checking off solid and setting the border width to be roughly 0.07. Now let's select the media out and press 2 to remove it from the second viewer so that we can focus on improving the rings. Inside the fast noise, we'll go to the image tab and uncheck Auto Resolution. Then we'll set the height to 1920. You could, of course, increase or lower these values, but 1920 is pretty good. Now under Color, we'll change the mode to Gradient and play around with the colors, having them go from a dark color to a bright one. And under the Noise tab, you can change the contrast, brightness, scale, and detail to whatever you like. And then we'll give it a seethe rate to make it animated and more alive. Now we can hit Shift and Space again, and this time search for Displace. Add that and connect a new fast noise to it. Inside the new fast noise, under Color, we're going to make it a gradient, going from bright red to bright green. And under the Noise tab, we will increase the contrast to around this value. And now selecting the Displace node and pressing 1 to bring it to the first viewer, we'll change the type to XY and play around with the X and Y refraction along with the X and Y offset. This warps or displaces the image using the red and green values of this fast noise. When I'm making my vortexes, I like to give them this sort of organic feel, and so I try to adjust these settings until the rings get this kind of flowy look. And now, since we want this to have a sort of pixelated style, we're going to hit Shift and Space again to find and add a mosaic blur. Press 1 to show it here. I like to have the pixel frequency at 40. You can also change the aliasing. Closer to 0 makes it really sharp, and closer to 2 makes it really soft. I prefer having it set to 1.17, but this is totally up to you. Now, this looks pretty nice, but it's all just the same image. We can't really fix that, but we can make it less noticeable. To achieve this, we'll go to the Duplicate node, and in the Jitter tab, find the Rotation Jitter. Let's set the Z rotation to about 89. Now, each ring is differently rotated, making it harder to see that they're the same image. You could also, in the Fast Noise node, increase the seethe rate to make them change appearance faster, so you don't see that they're the same image. Another thing you could do to make the vortex feel more alive is to go into the Image node and slightly alter all the X, Y, and Z rotations to give the rings this sort of angled look, different on each ring. Another thing you could do is select everything up until the Transform 3D1 node and duplicate it by hitting Ctrl-C and Ctrl-V. Then you can move it up here and connect it to the Merge node. Go into the new Transform node and change the X rotation to Time +4 to get another set of rings that you can change the colors of without affecting the other. You could make the rings be red and blue, like Tennant's or Eccleston's vortex. Or you can make something entirely different. I'm making mine green and purple. And so now you have two sets of rings with different colors. Oh yeah! In the Fast Noise nodes, under the Color tab, you can also bring down the alpha to really make them look like flowing energy. Alright, we're almost done, but they're still just floating in nothingness. They're just layered on top of this PNG background. To fix this, let's bring out a 3D shape and press 1 to bring it to the first viewer. Add a fast noise and connect it to our shape. And in our Shape 3D node, we'll set the shape to cylinder, making sure that the caps on the top and bottom are checked off. We'll also, in our Fast Noise node, under the Color tab, change this to gradient to get rid of this transparency. Then, in the Shape 3D node, we'll set the height to equal. What should the height equal? Well, we want to, eventually, merge this with our rings. And to be able to do that, this needs to be able to go around the rings. So we want to turn our cylinder into a three-dimensional ring. And so the height of our cylinder should equal the circumference of our ring circle. And what is the circumference? It's the side length times the amount of sides we've got. And so that's 4 times 50 in this case. This is because we've got 50 copies, with a distance of 4 between each copy. But again, if we were to change these values, our circumference would also change. So instead, let's set the height of our cylinder to equal an expression. Duplicate 3D1 dot, translate, dot Z, times, duplicate 3D1 dot, last copy. And so now we've got this really long pipe-like shape. To make it into a circle, let's hit Shift and Space once again, and this time search for Bender 3D. Add that and show it in the first viewer. Change the bend amount to 1. But hang on, The cylinder is gone. What happened? Go into the cylinder node and look here. Height subdivisions. 1. We are trying to bend something that only has one height subdivision into a whole circle. Obviously that won't work. And so, let's set our height subdivision to equal. Duplicate 3D1 dot. Last copy. Now it works. Now we have a ring. So now, let's hit Shift and Space again to add another Transform 3D node and set the X rotation to 90. Then, add another transform node to fix the same pivot issue we had with our ring circle. This time, we don't have to worry about the Z offset, and the Y offset we already have an expression for. Let's go into this transform node and copy it, and then paste it into our new transform node. Awesome. Once again, if we set the X rotation to equal the time, we'll just barely see that it isn't perfectly centered. It's offset by just a tiny bit, but it's by a minuscule amount. What's not minuscule, however, is this. Look, it's like a seam in the texture, and this, disgusting. So let's fix it. First, let's bring the transform node to the second viewer, and by holding down right-click while moving your mouse, you can move around in 3D space. To zoom in or out, hold Control while scrolling on your wheel or mouse pad. And so, we're going to position ourselves inside the vortex so that we can see our changes in real time. Now let's move all of this over here, then select our Fast Noise node and press Shift and Space to add a Transform XF node, setting the center X to 1, which moves it over to the side. Now it looks like a slide, and to fix that, we'll change the edges from canvas to wrap. So what we've done is we've moved the whole image to the right, and then telling it to take whatever's here, outside the screen, and wrap it around to here, linking these two edges. Now our seam is in the middle, which makes it easier for us to cover. So let's add a merge node and connect our fast noise to that as well, like this, merging it over itself. Now, if we mask the merge node with a rectangular mask, we get two seams. But we can move these around, and we can feather them by giving the rectangular mask a soft edge, like this. Now look at that. No seam, except for here, which is due to these edges not lining up. So let's add another transform node, and this time set the center Y to be 1, and change the edges to mirror. The reason why we use mirror instead of wrap is because I couldn't get it to work the same way. Instead, we hide the seam by just mirroring the image. Now this will also mirror the vortex, but that won't be noticeable when we change the fast noise. So let's go into the fast noise and fix that our vortex currently looks like paper. We do this by checking off the lock XY and then setting the Y scale to a really large number. I'm going to set my Y scale to 50 and my X scale to 4, but you can play around with these yourself until you get something you're happy with. Higher numbers will make the vortex more detailed. You can also change the angle slightly to give it this spiral-like effect. And of course, you can change the color as well. And so now, if we connect this transform node into our merge 3D2 node, we're pretty much done. Now you can make your own tweaks and changes, add some color corrector nodes, and play around with that. Speaking of, the reason why everything is so desaturated is so that you can play around with the saturation afterwards. I also like to darken a lot of these so that I can add some soft glows, increasing their thresholds, and under LUTs, maybe add some of Davinci Resolve's film looks to give it this cool effect. But now I leave this to you. Go and make your own time vortexes with your own colors and shapes. If you want to make an intro, maybe add some text. There are loads of tutorials on how to make 3D text on YouTube. Some of you mentioned that you were going to create your own fan series and whatnot. I am really looking forward to seeing you use this effect in your projects. But yeah, that's it. Go make all kinds of interesting vortexes, and I'll see you in the next video.